Here's a soft landing before we begin. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? Drop your country or city in the comments. Crete, Cairo, Copenhagen, or somewhere cozy in between. Settle in, breathe slow, and let's drift back across the Aegean to the dawn of European civilization. Begin with a map in your mind. South of the Greek mainland, where the Aegean thins toward the Libyan Sea, lies a long crescent-shaped island, Crete. Mountain chains run like a spine from west to east. Lefka Ori in the west, the Ida Range with the high peak of Psiloratis in the centre, and Dicte in the east, folding the land into valleys, gorges and high plateaus. Between them spread pockets of arable ground, the best of which is the wide Messara plain in the south. Steep coasts are punctuated by good anchorages, Knossos linked to the north coast at Heraklion, Malea and Phaistos close to fertile fields, Zakros almost touching the sea. Freshwater springs thread down the slopes, olives cling to terraced hillsides, goats and sheep graze where wheat, barley and vetch will not. This is the stage upon which Europe's first great civilization took shape. Archaeologists use the Bronze Age to mark a technological threshold when societies move from stone to bronze, an alloy of copper and tin that holds a sharper edge and a steadier point. On Crete, the Bronze Age begins around 3000 BCE, and the people we call Minoans rise through roughly three broad eras: Early Minoan c. 3000 to 2100 BCE, Middle Minoan circa 2100 to 1600 BCE, and Later Minoan circa 1600 to 1100 BCE. Within those spans sit more precise phases, but the main rhythm is clear: modest beginnings, flourishing complexity, and then transformation under new pressures. The palatial zenith, the moment when great court-centred complexes define the island's life, runs from about 2000 to 1450 BCE, with an initial wave of palaces, a period of destruction and rebuilding around the 1700s BCE, and an even more radiant second flourish before another round of upheavals. Crete's position matters as much as its mountains. It sits at the crossroads of the eastern Mediterranean, a sail's reach from the Nile Delta, the Levantine coast, southern Anatolia, the Cyclades, and the Greek mainland. Winds and currents encourage circular routes. Loaded ships could leave Cretan harbours carrying oil, wine, crafted goods, and fine pottery. Return with copper from Cyprus, tin from farther afield in Anatolia or beyond, faience and gold from Egypt, and ideas stitched into every trade. The sea is not a barrier in this world, it is the road. To live on Crete is to be a sailor or to no one. Even inland villages feel the tide through the olive presses, storage jars and amphorae that measure surplus with export in mind. If you look further back, Crete was no empty canvas awaiting the Bronze Age. Neolithic communities settled here by the 7th millennium BCE, probably bringing domestic grains and animals by boat. By the time bronze is adopted, the island already hosts dense village networks, local obsidian and stone tool industries, and a farming tradition tuned to Mediterranean rhythms. Sow in autumn after the first rains, harvest in spring before the withering heat, tend olives and vines over years rather than seasons. What changes in the 3rd and 2nd millennia is scale and coordination. Storage stops being a household matter and becomes a public planned affair. Paths widen into paved roads, small shrines yield to ceremonial courts, craft specialization accelerates, climate and geology set both promise and risk. Crete knows winter rain, long dry summers, and the shiver of earthquakes. Those quakes are frequent enough to leave a fingerprint in architecture, walls knitted with timber framing to flex rather than shatter, stairways and light wells designed with a surprising understanding of load and air, water channels cut to guide, drain and cleanse. The same tectonic setting that shakes palaces also created sheltered bays and coastal shelves that entice sailors to anchor and trade. Volcanic episodes elsewhere in the Aegean, most famously on Thera, Santorini, periodically dust the island with ash and trouble the sea, but the island's size and varied microclimates give it resilience. When coasts suffer, uplands can still produce. When one harbour silts, another remains clear. When we say European, we mean the continent as geographers draw it. The Minoans are of Europe by location, but their orientation is pan-Mediterranean. Their neighbours and partners are Egyptians, Levantines, Anatolians, islanders of the Cyclades, and later the Greeks we meet in Homer. In that mix, Crete holds distinctive thread. The language they spoke during their peak was not Greek. The script they used, Linear A, has resisted decipherment. Their art prefers fluid lines and natural motifs over the rigid military parades seen elsewhere. Their large centres, Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, Zakros, do not sit atop fort-like bastions bristling with walls. Instead, they spread around open courts and colonnaded corridors, as if urban life were a choreography of light, air and movement. Even if power certainly existed, it seems to have worked differently here, grounded in administration, ritual, and exchange rather than the constant spectacle of war. Ware also includes layers of settlement beyond the famous palaces. Coastal towns like Komos and Palaikastro face harbours and beaches where ships could be beached, repaired, and reprovisioned. Inland plateaus such as Lassithi, rimmed by mountains, offered secure farming basins and with their windmills and channels, the means to coax crops from thin soils. Peak sanctuaries crown ridgelines within sight of valleys and sea lanes, binding landscape and belief. Caves such as Psychro and Idaion Andron, cool and constant, drew offerings for generations, places where water, stone and silence encouraged vows. When is not a single moment but a heartbeat. Around 2000 BCE, the first palaces rise and administrative systems crystallize. After destructive events around the 1700s BCE, likely earthquakes perhaps compounded by social stresses, centres are rebuilt with more ambition. Storerooms lengthen, stairwells climb higher, fresco programs multiply. This Neopalatial phase, roughly 1700 to 1450 BCE, is Crete's brightest flame. Ceramic styles such as marine-style pottery show octopuses unfurling across vessels. Roads and bridges knit countryside to palace magazines. The island's imprint appears strongly at Acroterion Thera, where frescoed houses mirror Cretan tastes. After about 1450 BCE, new administrators using a different script, Linear B, run the show at Knossos, tying the island more directly to the Mycenaean mainland. Yet even then, place names endure, crafts persist, and the memory of earlier forms lingers in tools, recipes, and seasonal rites. To ground all of this in daily realities, imagine the calendar. Autumn ploughing begins once the first rains soak the dust. Oxen pull ploughs through stubble, while people broadcast seed by hand. Winter is for pruning vineyards and mending nets. Spring brings harvests of barley and emmer, sheaves stacked near threshing floors where hoof and flail separate grain from chaff. Summer's heat pushes work into morning and evening. Olive trees need little water but much patience. Vines are trained and tied, figs dried on mats, and clay vessels fired in kilns that puff smoke into the still air. Surplus is counted into pithoi, waist-high storage jars lining cool magazines, sealed with clay nodules impressed by carved stone seals. Those seals travel with people. People travel with stories. Stories travel with motifs that reappear in wall painting and jewellery. The island's geography encourages regional identities within a shared culture. Western Crete, with rugged uplands, speaks through different village patterns than the broad Massara in the south. Eastern Crete, with closer ties to the Dodecanese and the open sea, shows its own accents in burial and pottery. Yet ships and marriage, festivals and fairs weave these strands back together. The sea, constantly visible from slopes and ridges, keeps every community within a few days' reach of every other. Even the most secluded valley is only a pass or two from a beach where driftwood collects and dolphins sometimes arc. Finally, where and when is also about evidence and eyes. How we know what we think we know. Stratified layers in palatial courts fix sequences of building and rebuilding. Radiocarbon dates from charred seeds anchor those sequences in absolute time. Imported objects, Egyptian scarabs, Near Eastern cylinder seals, Cypriot copper ingots, timestamp connections. Tifra from the Thera eruption marks a horizon shared across the Aegean, and the style of a painted lily or the curve of a jug's handle ties one house to another 100 kilometres away. Put those clues together and a picture emerges. An island large enough to sustain complexity, placed perfectly to trade, repeatedly shaken but resilient, and synchronized to a Bronze Age world that recognized Crete not as a backwater, but as a bright node in a glittering network. Before anyone called them Minoan, the ruins were there. Tumbled stones on a low hill at Kefala, pottery sherds gleaming after rain, stories of labyrinths whispered by shepherds. 19th century travellers sketched door jambs and odd mushroom-shaped stones. Antiquarians bought seal stones in Cretan markets and guessed at a lost Bronze Age. Local curiosity did more than most histories admit. In 1878, a Cretan merchant named Minos Kalokairinos dug trial trenches on that very hill and uncovered storerooms packed with giant pithoi. He wanted to keep going, but the Ottoman authorities who still ruled the island halted the work. The idea that something vast slept beneath the olive trees did not go back to sleep. The man who would wake it in the world's imagination arrived with a mind sharpened by puzzles. Arthur Evans, an English scholar and future keeper of the Ashmolean Museum, had a passion for ancient scripts. In the 1890s, he handled engraved stones from Crete, ceilings impressed with tiny figures and symbols unlike anything from Greece or Egypt, and became convinced the island preserved a pre-Greek writing tradition. Political winds shifted. Crete moved toward autonomy. The chance to purchase land improved. Evans acquired the Knossos site, hired crews, and in March 1900 put spade to ground. What rose out of the soil over the next seasons was not a tomb or a single temple, but a labyrinthine complex of courts, corridors, staircases, magazines and rooms, stacked one above another like a city turned inward around its heart. He used a name borrowed from myth, Minoan, after the legendary Minos, to give identity to this Bronze Age culture. The label stuck because it was memorable, and because the architecture itself seemed to echo legend. Maze-like passageways, bull imagery and fresco fragments, and a building so large it could swallow hundreds of people in its courts. Evans and his team mapped storerooms lined with pithoi for oil and grain. They traced the light wells and air shafts that dropped daylight into inner rooms. They followed a grand staircase up multiple stories. In one chamber, a gypsum seat set against a painted wall became the famed throne room, with benches to either side and a lustral basin nearby. In another area, fragments of wall painting were lifted from debris. Dolphins, lilies, stepping youths, leaping bulls, each fragment 100 colours of dust, until conservators matched edges and hues and coaxed scenes back to life. There were texts too, but not the kind a scholar could open and read. Thousands of clay tablets and ceilings emerged from the magazines and offices of Knossos. Their signs belonged to unfamiliar scripts, a picture-rich system sometimes called Cretan hieroglyphic, and a more linear signary Evans dubbed Linear A. He thought both recorded the same local language and hoped he could solve them. He never did, and neither has anyone since for Linear A. The tablets seemed to be administrative, lists of goods, rations, offerings, more ledger than literature. Yet they gave the palace a voice, even if muffled. Later, at Knossos and on the mainland, another script appeared. Linear B. Mid-20th century work would reveal that Linear B encodes early Greek, used by Mycenaean administrators who took over Crete after about 1450 BCE. That discovery, long after Evans' lifetime, would force a revision. The last phase of Gnosis's bureaucracy spoke Greek, while the earlier heart of the system wrote a different, still silent tongue. Knossos was only the beginning. While Evans orchestrated a large excavation and published lavish volumes, other scholars, often organised by national archaeological schools, opened windows across Crete. Italians under Federico Halbherr had already been at work at Gortyn, reading the Great Law Code inscription and establishing a base for wider exploration. At Phaistos on the Messara plain, Luigi Pernier uncovered another sprawling palace centred on a sunlit court. There in 1908 he found the Phaistos disc, a fired clay disc stamped on both sides with spiralling signs unlike any other script, still undeciphered and still a magnet for speculation. Near Phaistos, at Hagia Triada, excavators revealed an elegant villa and a painted limestone sarcophagus with ritual scenes, processions, libations, musicians, one of the rare narrative artworks to survive in the round from the Bronze Age Aegean. To the north and east, the French worked at Malea, tracing magazines and quarters, and a plan similar in spirit to Knossos, though distinct in detail. At the island's far eastern edge, the palace of Zakros lay almost on the shore. Nikolaus Platon would later explore it extensively, its rooms strewn with clay tablets, and its storerooms still littered with crushed vessels when the roof came down in antiquity. In the northeast, at Palai Castro, British excavators uncovered a substantial town with streets, workshops, and houses that brought the scale of everyday urban life into focus. This was not a culture of a single dominant court, but of multiple centres and their surrounding communities. One of the most important early revelations came from an American archaeologist, Harriet Boyd Hawes, who in 1901 led a team to Gurnia on the isthmus of Arapetra and mapped an entire town, houses, alleys, stairways, small shrines, frozen beneath the soil. Her work showed the texture of life beyond palaces, the hum of potters and metal workers, the rhythms of cooking and storage, the steps that wore smooth, where people passed daily between room and roof. Elsewhere, surveyors traced peak sanctuaries on mountain crests, where figurines and votive limbs lay in clusters among the stones, testifying to open-air worship with valley views and sea horizons. The story of how we found them is also the story of how we chose to present what was found. Evans did not simply clear Knossos. He restored it, building reinforced concrete colonnades, repainting walls, and erecting timber-look columns flared downward in a style he inferred from surviving bases and fragments. He brought in artists, Émile Gilliéron and his son among them, to reconstruct frescoes from thousands of coloured flakes. Some reconstructions are masterly, others went beyond what the fragments could support, creating famous images that later scholars would temper or correct. The Prince of the Lilies, for example, appears to be a modern composite assembled from pieces that likely belong to more than one figure. The vivid dolphin fresco that now hovers over a doorway was installed in a place it did not originally occupy. Evans' restorations made the site legible to visitors and unforgettable to photographers, but they also seeded debates about authenticity that continue to this day. The concrete itself, harsh in the Cretan sun, ages differently than limestone and gypsum. The colours reflect early 20th century tastes as much as Bronze Age palettes. Interpretation travelled with restoration. Evans envisioned a prosperous, relatively peaceful thalassocracy, a sea-based dominion that needed no massive defensive walls because its navy and trade networks kept threats at bay. He emphasised nature-loving art, athletic bull leaping, and what he read as a prominent mother goddess religion, supported by the famous faience snake goddess figurines found in a deposit at Knossos. Later work has complicated and sometimes challenged these views. Weapons and warrior imagery, though less dominant than Mycenaean art, do appear. Some sites show fortification in later phases, and the religious landscape looks more varied than a single goddess cult permits. Yet Evans's central insight, that Crete in the Bronze Age fostered a complex court-centered culture with administration, storage, ritual and art woven together, has endured, refined by a century of finds. As decades passed, techniques multiplied and the circle of investigators widened. Stratigraphy, the careful reading of layers, guided early fieldwork, but radiocarbon dating anchored sequences in absolute time. The thick band of volcanic ash from the Thera eruption became a horizon line across Aegean sites, although scholars still debate the exact year of the blast within a range of the mid-2nd millennium BCE. Tree rings, ice cores, and radiocarbon samples each add pieces to that puzzle. Petrographic thin-section analysis traced pottery clays to their geological sources, showing where vessels were local and where they sailed in from afar. Residue analysis pulled whispers of ancient contents, wine, olive oil, aromatic resins, from porous sherds. Zooarchaeologists read patterns of butchery and herding in bones. Archaeobotanists rebuilt diets from charred seeds and olive pits. Paleosols and pollen cores reconstructed hillsides and fields, greening and thinning across centuries. Writing systems drew their own detectives. Evans's publication of the Knossos tablets gave scholars the raw material. Alice Kober built crucial grids of sign patterns in the 1940s. Michael Ventris, working with John Chadwick, announced in 1952 that Linear B recorded early Greek, unlocking ledgers from Pylos and Mycenae, and the later Knossos bureaucracy. Linear A remains mute, although scholars continue to compare its signs and structures to other languages. The Phaistos disk, stamped rather than inscribed, continues to hover on the edge of resolution, a Bronze Age riddle in spiral form. Each script is not only a key to language but a window on institutions. Rations for workers, lists of sacrificial animals, inventories of oil scented with saffron or rose, tallies of wheels and chariot parts that hint at workshops humming near palace walls. Beyond Crete, a buried city on another island provided a mirror. On Thera, Santorini, the site of Akrotiri, excavated systematically from the late 1960s onward, revealed houses several stories high, frescoed rooms, paved streets, and storerooms where jars still stood in neat rows. Its art, flotillas of ships, boys gathering saffron, swallows darting among crocuses, echoed the Minoan aesthetic so strongly that scholars speak of a Minoanized Cycladic culture there. Akrotiri's catastrophe, entombed by volcanic ash, preserved table settings and wall hooks, raw materials and finished goods, offering a snapshot of life in a world that looked toward Crete and shared its tastes. The people behind all this stone and paint have also come into clearer view. Burial studies chart changing mortuary customs, from communal tombs to more individualized graves, while isotopic analysis of teeth traces childhood origins, showing that some individuals grew up far from the places they were buried, evidence of mobility in a maritime society. Ancient DNA, where preservation allows, suggests that Minoans descended largely from early farmers of the Aegean and Anatolia, with local threads woven in over millennia. Mycenaeans share much of that ancestry, but also carry a component from populations to the north and east, underscoring connected yet distinct trajectories. These are broad strokes, careful to avoid overreach, but they tie biological history to the trade routes and intermarriages visible in artifacts. As the discipline matured, so did its ethics. Early collectors pried artifacts from soil and shipped them to distant museums. Now, Greek and Cretan archaeologists lead most projects, and conservation, context, and community engagement guide decisions. At Knossos, teams stabilize walls and floors, monitor humidity in storerooms, and re-evaluate Evans' concrete where it endangers original fabric. Museums on Crete, Heraklion foremost among them, display finds in ways that emphasize provenance and process. A jar is labelled not only by style and date, but by the room, the layer, the floor where it stood when a ceiling fell or a store burned. Even the words we use have evolved. Palace suggests a king and court in the later European sense. Many scholars now prefer palatial centre or court complex, terms that leave room for multiple authorities and functions. Throne room remains a convenient label, but the room's use likely braided ritual, council and administration in patterns not captured by modern monarchic metaphors. The horns of consecration, the labyrinths, the lustral basin, names coined in the early decades, are now treated as descriptive tags, not settled proofs of a specific cult. Caution has replaced certainty without dimming the marvel, and still, spades turn. Surface surveys map farmsteads and guard posts between the great centres. Underwater archaeologists trace ancient anchorages along shores shape-shifted by millennia of storms. Digital tools knit plans and photographs into 3D reconstructions that let researchers test how light fell in a court at midsummer, or how voices carried from corridor to court. Each new method answers one question and asks another. Who organised labour to quarry, haul and dress so much stone? How were regional centres coordinated or rivalrous? Which routes did ships take in winter winds versus summer? What stories did people tell about the bulls on their walls and the double axes on their altars? We didn't meet the Minoans all at once. We met them as a procession, a merchant's trench revealing Pithoi, a scholar's hunch about scripts leading to land deeds and pickaxes, fresco flakes reassembled under lamplight, a law code on a Roman wall suggesting deeper pasts, a disc with spirals of symbols that refuses to confess, a town planned by a determined woman when the field hardly admitted women, a city ash-sealed on another island, its rooms paused mid-gesture. Piece by piece, place by place, technique by technique, the outline sharpened. What we call discovery is really a long conversation between stones and questions, between a landscape and the eyes that learn how to see it. Begin at the heart, a long sunlit court open to the sky, its paving stones warmed by afternoon light. Around it, rooms and corridors layer upward and inward, stitched together by staircases and doorways that open and close like the lungs of a city. This is the logic of the Cretan palatial centres, Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, Zakros and others, complexes planned around a rectangular central court where processions could cross, dances could unfurl and voices could rise without walls to block them. Everything else, storage, workshops, shrines, halls, offices, stair towers, spirals from that great open rectangle, as if the building itself were designed to inhale light and exhale people. Approach from the west and you often meet a broad paved forecourt, a kind of outdoor plaza with causeways picked out in different stone. At Knossos, 3 great circular pits sit in this western area, massive stone-lined couloirs, whose function has sparked arguments for a century, grain silos, ritual enclosures, or both at different times. Steps along one edge become shallow seating, a theatral area, where spectators could watch arrivals, offerings, or seasonal rites. These plazas do not fence you out. They draw you in, across paving that subtly guides the feet, toward monumental doorways, columned porches, and corridors that prepare you for the shock of the court. Inside, the architecture moves like water. Corridors expand into foyers. Foyers resolve into columned halls. One device appears again and again, the pier and door partition, or polythyron. Imagine a wall made of a row of stone piers with wooden doors set between them. Open a few and you have a bright, breezy suite. Close them and you create intimate rooms for storage or ceremony. This modularity lets a single architectural frame host multiple moods. Cool shade at noon, long sight lines at festival, privacy when counts are tallied and seals impressed. Lightwells and stairwells work in tandem with these partitions. A lightwell is a vertical shaft open to the sky at the top, lined with windows and doorways on each floor. Sunlight drops in, air rises out, and rooms clustered around it, stay bright and ventilated without wide exterior exposures. At Knossos' east wing, a grand staircase climbs in flights around such a well, the steps shallow and numerous, making upward movement more of a float than a climb. Materials matter here. Masons set neatly dressed blocks of limestone and the island's soft, glittering gypsum in courses at corners and door jambs, ashlar, then filled wall interiors with rubble bound by clay or lime plaster. Timber, likely cypress, was not an afterthought but an armature. Horizontal beams laced through the masonry, vertical posts framed openings, and wooden columns stood on stone bases to carry upper floors. This timber-laced system flexed during earthquakes, absorbing shocks that would shatter pure stone. You can still see the logic in pillar crypts, rooms where squat stone pillars stand as structural anchors and bear incised double-axe marks, and in the way staircases are boxed by heavy piers, their treads pegged into timber that acts like tendons. Roofs were probably flat, layered with beams, brush and plaster, making terraces where people could work, dry goods, or watch the court below. One of the most recognisable features is the column itself, thick at the top and tapering downward, the reverse of later Greek forms. Set on a round or square base and capped by a cushion-like capital, these wooden shafts were often coated in plaster and painted, deep reds, browns, sometimes black, so the rhythm of posts against whitewashed walls reads like a musical score. The downward taper is not just style. It lowers the centre of visual gravity and may help the eye read the load path from beam to base. It also sets Cretan halls apart from everything north and east in the Bronze Age. Walk under such a colonnade and immediately you are not in a Mycenaean Megron or an Egyptian hyperstyle forest. Water and waste received engineering equal to ceremony. Terracotta pipes with carefully cut bell and spigot joints run beneath floors and along walls, tightening as they descend to maintain pressure and flow. At Knossos, channels collect rainwater from roofs and courtyards and conduct it into drains. Some rooms include latrines with stone seats set over sloped channels that could be flushed with water. Settling basins interrupt the runs so silt falls out before it can clog downstream passages. In several centres, conduits feed from upland springs, where gravity begins the work, so that washing basins and fountains can run without buckets crossing the court. The sound would have mattered. Water falling lightly in a basin, a private hush away from the public brightness outside. Storage is everywhere, but especially west of the court, where long magazines, parallel rooms with raised clay thresholds, once held ranks of pithoi. Those great jars, sometimes chest-high or taller, seem to press outward on the rooms even when they're gone, because masons built low bulks and sockets and floors to keep them from shifting. On many pithoi you can still find tie holes for rope and clay ceilings that once locked lids. Nearby, small pebble and stone weights, standardised in sets, tell of measured transfers. Tablets from these zones list oil, grain, perfumed unguents, textiles, bronze, and livestock on the hoof or in cuts. Storerooms are not dim by accident. They're cool and controlled, close to the record rooms where scribes could log inflows and outflows the moment a seal impression popped from wet clay. Domestic suites and elite reception rooms cluster mostly to the east and north at Knossos, and in analogous wings at other centres. Here, ground plans get intricate. Small anterooms, inner chambers with benches, pillar-flanked doorways, and those famous lustral basins, sunken rooms reached by short stairways, their walls plastered smooth. Whether those basins hosted ritual bathing, symbolic descents, or something more prosaic remains debated, but their placement, often close to ceremonial halls, argues for charged actions rather than everyday washing. Floors of polished gypsum slabs gleam softly. Thresholds are worn smooth where 1,000 sandalled feet turned inward. Window frames once held shutters that could be swung to sculpt light into bands and squares across painted walls. art is not sprinkled on as decoration, it is built into the architecture. Plasterers laid fine lime coats over masonry and timber, and then painters layered pigments, mineral reds and yellows, carbon blacks, blues ground from imported stones, onto damp surfaces, a fresco technique that fuses image and wall into one skin. In corridors leading to courts, you might pass between painted processions. In stairwells, dolphins seem to ride the shafts of light. In reception rooms, rosettes, lilies, and flowing spirals soften the geometry of stone. Relief work appears too. Gypsum panels carved with shallow fluting, pebbled floors picked out in patterns, and wooden door leaves perhaps overlaid with bronze sheet gleaming in lamplight at dusk. The architecture is a stage, and the art its script, one you read with your whole body as you move. Orientation is not random. Many central courts are longer on the north-south axis, with entrances aligned to cardinal directions or to landmarks such as Mount Juktas, a peak sanctuary visible from Knossos. When a procession crosses the court at certain times of year, the sun falls along known paths, tracing routes of shadow that repeat with the seasons. West facades tend to be the most formal, with deep porches, door jambs picking up light like mirrors, and carefully dressed blocks that telegraph stability. South entrances at Knossos, the South Propylaeum, arrive through a narrow dramatic passage that opens suddenly into space, magnifying the sensation of emergence and arrival. Movement outside the complex received equal care. Paved roads, flagged with large stones, cambered for runoff, and bordered by low curbs, radiate from palaces into their hinterlands. The royal road at Knossos, with its ramps and drainage gutters, shows how carts, litters, and foot traffic were separated and accommodated. Bridges cross seasonal streams, retaining walls tame slopes. Workshops for potters, stone carvers, and metal workers sit near gates, drawing on traffic for materials and markets. A palace is less a standalone monument than a knot in a wide net of paths, farms, docks, and sanctuaries. The buildings remember disaster and recovery in their very bones. Floors rise, walls thicken, doorways shift as phases change from earlier to later palatial periods. After earthquakes or fires, rebuilders reuse sound foundations and added reinforcements. More timber ties, heavier jambs, broader steps. At Melia and Phaistos you can trace where a corridor once ran and where a later wall pinched it, perhaps to control access more tightly. At Zakros, close to the sea, storerooms lay crushed beneath roof falls that left vessels in place, a snapshot of a working palace the day it failed. Each cut of stone and patch of plaster is both function and memory, a repair that tells you what broke. Religious symbols inhabit structural places. Double axe marks on pillars, horns of consecration set along parapets and roof lines, and small bench shrines tucked into corners convert passages into thresholds. Pillar crypts, low dim rooms under stair landings or near magazines, may have hosted ritual actions with lamps, libations and small offerings, their ceilings supported by those inscribed posts. Roof edges and terraces, visible from the court below, could display portable objects, vases, figurines, standards, during festivals, so that architecture becomes altar by elevation alone. Administration does not hide, it sits right where circulation and storage meet. Rooms with low benches for scribes, baskets for tablets, and jars for ceilings cluster at magazine ends and near major doorways. You can almost stage the workflow, goods rolled or carried in, counted and weighed, entries pressed into wet clay, lids sealed and keys turned. Only the keys here are strings of ceilings and the authority to break them. A palatial centre is a brain as much as a body, nerves running along corridors, pulses quickening at thresholds, decisions breathed into tablets that pile up until a fire, accidental or destructive, bakes them into the archaeological record. What might it feel like to live in such a place? Morning light pours down the east wing stair. Cool air rises from storerooms. The court's paving dries quickly after a brief winter rain, because masons tipped each slab just enough to send water to stone gutters. By midday, shutters are adjusted. Polythyra are partly closed to cut glare but keep breeze. The scent of olive oil mixes with wet plaster and the faint mineral sweetness of gypsum. In the evening, lamps prick corridors. A procession of people with Ritter, conical libation vessels, crosses the court, the soft thump of feet on stone beating time. Above, on a roof terrace, someone checks the cistern, clears silt from a settling trap, and sets jars for dew to form on their rims in the cool night. Across the island, each centre has its signature within a shared grammar. Paistos spreads across a stepped hillside, its grand flights of stairs feeling theatrical even without an audience. Malia balances formal courts with broad storage wings that underline its role as a redistribution hub. Zakros huddles close to a bay, its plan compact and maritime, as if the whole complex were a stone ship beached on shore. Petrus, Cato Chorio, and other sites add regional inflections, different access routes, different balances between storage and ceremony, without departing from the core language of courts, light wells, magazines and modular halls. The system extends down into houses and up into landscape. In towns like Gurnia, multi-storey dwellings borrow palatial tricks, narrow staircases wrapping light wells, drains tucked beneath floors, small polythyra creating seasonal rooms that grow and shrink with weather and work. On mountain peaks, sanctuaries mirror palatial symbolism in miniature, low enclosures, offering tables, and sight lines that tie sea, valley and court into one ritual map. Roads link these peaks to palaces. Processions could have stitched them together on holy days, bodies moving along the very alignments the architects cut in stone. Above all, the architecture is kinetic. It anticipates the flow of crowds, the turn of seasons, the shock of tremors, the need to cool and to warm, to gather and to separate, to store and to display, to count and to celebrate. Light wells aren't skylights, they are lungs. Polythyra aren't doors, they are muscles that flex. Drains aren't just pipes, they are the building's veins, keeping it clean and alive. When you stand on a central court and feel wind come from 4 directions at once, down a stair, through a colonnade, across a corridor, and over a parapet, you understand why these places lasted through rebuild after rebuild. They were not merely built, they were tuned, a long experiment in taming air, light, water and human movement into a single resilient form. Step into a painted room on Crete, and the first impression is motion. Dolphins arc as if they've just broken the surface. Lilies lean in a breeze you can almost feel. Youths sprint or vault across bulls with limbs stretched like bowstrings. Minoan art rarely freezes a moment the way a carved stela might. It breathes. That vitality begins with the medium itself. Walls were coated in fine lime plaster and painted while still damp, true fresco, so pigments fused with the surface and became the wall. Artists returned with secco retouches after the plaster dried to sharpen lines or add details. A pupil in an eye, the shimmer of a fish's scales. Mineral reds and yellows came from iron oxides, blacks from carbon, whites from lime, blues from imported stones or manufactured frits often described as Egyptian blue. The palette is limited but alive, layered in broad, confident fields and quick, elastic lines that favour curves over angles. Subjects mirror the environment and the sea routes that tied Crete to the wider Mediterranean. Marine life pours across late Minoan vessels in what scholars call the marine style. Octopuses unfurl tentacles that clutch handles, their eyes slightly comic and strangely sympathetic. Nautiloids, argonauts, and sprigs of seaweed float between them. Little fish peck at bubbles. On earlier palace-era pottery, the Kamara's style shows a different sensibility. Wafer-thin clay walls thrown to impossible lightness, dark grounds enlivened by white, orange and red swirls and dotted patterns, all high contrast and playful. Later still, a floral style lets papyrus, lilies and ivy coil across jars, while the so-called palace style tightens things up into more formal symmetrical arrangements, perhaps reflecting new tastes under Mycenaean administration. Through it all, the hand loves spirals, waves, tendrils, curls of hair and horn, a graphic shorthand for motion and growth. On walls, figures are stylized but observant. Men are usually given reddish-brown skin, women pale cream, a convention shared with Egypt but rendered in a brisk Aegean line. Bodies are elastic, waists cinched by belts, torsos arched, calves springing. Clothing is both costume and choreography. Men wear belted loincloths or kilts. Women appear in flounced skirts and fitted bodices with bare breasts, a look familiar from Knossos figurines and frescoes. Hair swings in long dark locks. Jewellery gleams at neck and wrist. In some scenes, elaborate headdresses and sashes form visual rhythms of their own. The point is not portrait realism, but essential gesture. A single curve of a back communicates speed, a tilt of a chin, alertness, a fan of fingers, the climax of a leap. Bull leaping is the most famous motif, though its exact mechanics are debated. In the wall paintings from Knossos, a human athlete grasps a charging bull by the horns, flips in an arc over its spine, and lands behind it, or is shown mid-flight as if suspended in a gravity-defying instant. The bull itself is a study in momentum, barrel chest, lowered head, hooves splayed to grip the ground. Whether these images record an athletic ritual performed in courts, an idealized spectacle, or a mythic drama, they compress danger and elegance into one continuous line. Elsewhere, processions move in file, bearing vessels and offerings. Dancers sway. Seated figures, possibly deities or elites, receive the flow of people like a shoreline takes waves. The eye reads these friezes as music, measures of repeated steps, then variations. Faience, stone, metal and ivory extend the same aesthetic into the hand. The faience, snake goddesses from Knossos, glazed composition figures with uplifted arms and coiling serpents, are among the most reproduced objects from Bronze Age Crete. Their shimmering surfaces and patterned skirts catch light in a way that suggests both ritual intensity and the craftsman's delight in colour. Steatite and serpentine were carved into rita, ritual libation vessels, and vases. Some rita carry reliefs so animated you can hear them. The Harvester vase from Hagia Triada shows a procession of men with rakes or flails, one singer's ribs swelling as he sings, another shaking a sistrum-like rattle. An agricultural scene that reads as labour, festival and soundscape at once. Bull's head rita, with inlaid shell eyes and gilded horns, render the animal with a blend of tenderness and power. When liquid poured from the mouth, image and action fused. Seal stones, tiny masterpieces carved in intaglio, brought art into the administrative heart of Minoan life. Cut from steatite, jasper, agate or carnelian, often drilled to be worn, these seals pressed identities into clay nodules that secured pythos lids, knotted cords, or folded documents. Because a seal had to read clearly in a space barely larger than a fingernail, Minoan engravers distilled scenes to their essence. A leaper and a bull compressed into a single balanced knot of forms, a lion pouncing, a human meeting a hybrid creature known as the Minoan genius, a soft-snouted, pot-bellied figure ultimately inspired by Egypt's Tawere, but naturalized into Cretan iconography. Ships glide across some stones, mountains and shrines appear on others, double axes and horns of consecration mark sacred space. Each image functioned as both signature and story, a legal stamp that was also a portable gallery. Jewellery speaks in gold and fine granulation. The famous bee's pendant from Malea, two bees, or wasps, facing each other as they clasp a drop of honey, uses filigree and granules so tiny they look like pollen caught on legs. Signet rings carry miniature scenes in relief, a woman standing on a hilltop flanked by sacred horns, a figure descending into or emerging from a lustral basin, a boat under oars. These are not random pictures. They compress ritual landscapes, peaks, trees, altars, into wearable theology. Pins, diadems, and necklaces surely moved with processions. As bodies danced, art danced too. Sculpture in the round is rarer but vivid where it appears. Ivory acrobats from Knossos curve their bodies like dolphins. Small stone and terracotta figures of worshippers, with upraised arms, become common in later phases, their open postures turning the stillness of clay into a kind of permanent invocation. Even utilitarian objects carry aesthetic decisions. Lampstands, loom weights, and cosmetic boxes are shaped and incised with care. Tablewares balance in the hand. Cooking pots show a potter's sense of heat and liquid as much as a cook's. Textiles are mostly lost, but frescoes and tools let us read their ghost. Loom weights crowd house rooms, telling us weaving was not occasional but constant. The garments painted on walls are cut and patterned. Belts cinch waists tight. Flounces are stacked in regular tiers. Sashes loop. Dyes likely included plant reds, madder, yellows, saffron, and blues, woad or imported indigo, with purple extracted from murex shells along Aegean shores. The crisp stripes and chevrons in wall painting are painterly shorthand for woven complexity. When a figure turns, you can almost feel the fabric's weight and sway. If the world beyond Crete enters Minoan workshops, it does so as inspiration rather than instruction. Egyptian papyrus and palm motifs curl across vases. Griffins, lathe, beaked, winged, guard thrones. Rosettes and lotus buds dot borders, yet the line stays Minoan, loose, buoyant, asymmetrical where symmetry would be stiff. In return, Minoan motifs travelled outward. Mycenaean artisans borrowed marine and floral themes for inlaid metal daggers and painted pottery. Cycladic painters at Akrotiri on Thera covered their walls with flotillas, swallows, and saffron gatherers in a visual language that feels Cretan in spirit, even when local in detail. Architecture and image are inseparable. Halls are planned like galleries with controlled light. Stairwells act as vertical frames for swimming dolphins. Corridors turn into slow reveals where a painted procession meets the living one. Relief gypsum panels give walls a tactile ripple. Pebble mosaics underfoot cool rooms and break the glare. In the Knossos throne room complex, griffins flank a gypsum seat, their plumed necks arched. Water basins nearby and low benches create a setting where ritual, council, and spectacle blend. Elsewhere, small bench shrines with horns and tables for offerings turn side rooms into theatres of scent and colour. Oil, smoke, the glint of metal, the hush of plaster lit by lamps. Not every famous image is exactly what early restorers claimed. Some wall paintings at Knossos were reconstructed boldly from tiny fragments, combining pieces that later scholars would separate. But even with those corrections, the underlying aesthetic is clear and consistent across sites controlled by different excavators. An embrace of natural forms, a preference for movement, and an eye for pattern that makes even an accounting jug feel elegant. At Phaistos and Hagia Triada, painted sarcophagi and wall fragments show processions of musicians, libations poured at altars, and chariots that glide rather than clatter, ritual narrated like a calm song. At Zakros, stored ceilings and tablet fragments point to office walls once bright with colour. At Malea, the balance of big storage and painted thresholds hints at art as the velvet glove over a very organised hand. Music and scent thread the art together. The harvester procession singer with open mouth and swelling chest is almost audible. Double pipes, lyres, rattles, and clappers appear in reliefs and tiny seals. Writer shaped like cones or animal heads exist to be filled and poured. When liquid streams in ritual, it circles back to the painted sea creatures and the rhythm of the human body in dance. Kernoi, ring-shaped offering tables with multiple little cups, invite variety. Grains, fruits, oils, perhaps flowers. visual motifs become a multi-sensory program. You do not just look at a lily painted on the wall. You smell crushed petals in oil and step over garlands laid across thresholds. Workshop organisation shows in repetition with difference. Certain hand habits, the way an eye is dotted, how a tentacle splits, how a lily's stamens bend, let archaeologists group fresco fragments and pots to specific painters or workshops even without signatures. Clay recipes are regional. Petrographic studies trace the clays, and fingerprints impressed into handles sometimes preserve the literal touch of the maker. Tools were simple. Brushes of plant fibres or animal hair, stone burnishers, copper chisels, drills spun with bowstrings for tiny seal details. Out of those modest means came images that still feel poised, alert, almost amused. Violence and kingship, so dominant in many Bronze Age arts, step to the side here. Weapons appear, but rarely as centerpieces. Fortification imagery is minimal. Rulers, if shown, are blurred into ritual roles rather than enthroned conquerors. Authority wears a circlet and receives a libation rather than trampling enemies. That is not naivety. It is a choice about what to display in shared spaces. In a culture that organised warehouses and ledgers with great discipline, the eye rests on waves, leaves, and bodies in motion. Even when Mycenaean tastes begin to press in, more rigid symmetry, more chariots and spears, the Cretan hand keeps softening edges, coaxing life into patterns. In the end, what makes this art feel so awake is its refusal to over-outline the world. Fish are simple loops and darts. Bulls are blocks of curved power. Humans are bands of energy tied at the waist. The line "trust your eye" to complete it, as though the painter knew the viewer's body would remember how it feels to run, to bend, to breathe salt air. 3,500 years later, in the quiet of a museum or the shade of a palace corridor that trust still holds, the dolphins still jump, the lilies still lean, the people still move, begin with a fingertip pressed into wet clay and then pulled away. A shallow groove, a tiny wedge, the memory of a hand. Most of what the Minoans wrote lived this way, on small tablets of unbaked clay, quickly inscribed with a stylus and meant to last only as long as the accounting year. They were not carved to defy time like stone stelae. They were working notes, the breath of administration. When fire swept storerooms and offices, those notes accidentally became our archives. Flames hardened what was never meant to endure, freezing a pulse of voices that, even hardened, still speak in a language we cannot yet hear. 3 intertwined systems carry that breath. The earliest is often called Cretan hieroglyphic, a compact set of signs with a pictorial look. Bird heads, combs, double axes, jars, impressed or incised mainly on seals and small bars. These appear in the early palace period, the centuries when central courts and storerooms first knit the island's economy into networks. The material fits their function. Seals were personal tools of trust and authority. Their images and signs bit into wet clay nodules that closed jars, tied cords, and labelled bundles. A glance could tell you who controlled a container, which room it came from, which day it was counted. The hieroglyphic signs are few compared to later scripts, and most inscriptions are short. Initials, names, tags. They look like pictures, but they act like writing. Fixed sets of repeated signs carrying information, not simple decoration. From this soil grows a more linear way of writing. The script we call Linear A. The signs are less pictorial, more abstract. Angles, loops, small squares and hooks, and they run tidily across tablets, roundels, and clay labels. Linear A appears across the island during the height of palatial life. It is a syllabary. Each sign likely represents a simple syllable, probably a consonant plus vowel shape. There are also number marks and small ideograms, tiny pictures for man, woman, for commodities like oil, wine, grain, wool, perhaps for animals and vessels, so a single line might mix syllables that spell a name with a pictogram for oil, and a sequence of strokes that add to a total. A vertical tick often serves as a divider, keeping units, or words, from blending into one another. Everything about it feels practical and organised. This was the handwriting of storekeepers, weavers' stewards, shepherds' overseers, perfumers' clerks, all answering to a palace that needed every jar, fleece and measure to be traced. And yet the language Linear A records is still silent to us. Scholars have mapped its sign inventory and habits, compared frequencies, grouped endings that look like case or number markers, and proposed values by analogy with its later cousin, Linear B. The script is legible, the tongue is not. Many attempts have sailed across the centuries, linking the underlying language to early Anatolian tongues, to Semitic, to distant relatives around the Mediterranean, or to the later non-Greek speech remembered on Crete as Etiocraton, but no proposal has carried the full cargo of evidence ashore. What we can say is already a lot. The script is used for administration. It prefers lists to long sentences. It likes formulae for offerings and dedications on stone libation tables and small metal objects, and it shows a bureaucracy counting and moving goods with regularity. That is the paradox of Minoan writing, unreadable but unmistakably purposeful. The third strand arrives like a new hand taking the pen. After about 1450 BCE, when a wave of destructions and reorganisation swept Crete, another script appears in the offices at Knossos, Linear B. It is closely related in shape and system to Linear A, a refined syllabary with numbers and ideograms, but the language it writes is an early form of Greek. Where Linear A remains mute, Linear B reads. It tells us about sheep counted by flocks and age classes, perfumed oils mixed in recipes scented with saffron, rose or sage, bronze rations for smiths, wheels and chariot bodies in workshops, land holdings and religious offerings, lists of personnel, men and women, sometimes children, attached to specific tasks. The bureaucracy on Crete at this time is no longer purely Minoan in language, but it inherits Minoan methods, the forms of tablets, the habits of sealing, the arrangement of offices near magazines, the cool efficiency of staple finance flowing through court-centred buildings. In that sense, Linear B is a translation not only of words, but of an entire administrative way of life. Look closer at the media, because the media are the message. Tablets come in two common shapes. There are long, narrow, leaf tablets, easy to hold in one hand, where a scribe can run items in a column, sheep from this district, jars of oil from that workshop, cloth pieces from a particular storeroom. Then there are larger, page tablets that collect summaries and totals, overviews for supervisors. Roundels, small flat discs of clay, often carry seal impressions around the edge and short linear entries across the face, a portable receipt that could travel with a shipment. Hanging nodules, little lumps of clay pierced for a string, tie to a bag or door latch and bear a seal and a scribble, a name, a number, a short tag. Direct object sealings press right onto a lid or stopper, fixing identity and contents until the moment of opening. When the string is cut, the clay breaks, and authority is exercised. The system works because it is simple, modular, and visual. Anyone trained in the habitus of the palace could read the situation at a glance. Numbers march alongside words. The notation is decimal, single strokes for ones, bars for tens, signs for hundreds and thousands. Fractions appear when volumes or weights demand precision. The numerals often sit next to ideograms, a jar sign, a sheep sign, eliminating ambiguity. Weights and measures are standardized, not only on clay but in stone. Sets of pebble and cut stone weights turn up by scales, graduated in predictable ratios so a scribe can check a delivery without argument. Capacity is measured in regular units, dry and liquid. Lengths, areas, and perhaps even labour obligations have their own quiet arithmetic. The palatial economy is not just centralised, it is quantified. Where did all of this live in the buildings? In the seams between movement and storage. Rooms at the ends of magazines, corners off main corridors, small chambers near big doors. These are where scribes sat. Stylus in hand, with baskets for tablets and strings of ceilings hanging from pegs. You can stage the choreography. A team arrives with jars. A guard breaks the old seal. The steward measures. The scribe notes. A new ceiling is impressed. A tablet is tucked into a basket. A roundel goes with the messenger. Later the totals move onto a larger page, perhaps to be reviewed in a room with benches along the wall and a basin for ritual libations before decisions. At the end of the accounting period, harvest, textile run, sailing season, the little leaf tablets are often recycled, kneaded back into usable clay. Only fire forbids the return to mud. That is why archives seem to vanish and reappear across centuries. They were never meant to be permanent. Scribes leave signatures without trying. Each hand has a way of making a sign. How high a loop rises, how sharply a stroke turns. That lets modern analysts sort dozens of distinct hands within a single archive. At Knossos under Linear B, the tally runs to scores of scribes. At other centres it is fewer, but still multiple. This implies training, perhaps in-house apprenticeships where youths copied older tablets to learn proportions and order, and a staff large enough to divide labour by commodity or district. The stylus itself was likely bone or wood, with a squared tip for pressing neat wedges and a pointed end for finer incisions. On stone libation tables and metal pins, the durable surfaces where linear A dedicatory formulae appear, the tool changes, the stroke becomes a cut rather than a press, but the habit of clear spacing, short lines and tidy alignment persists. Because linear A will not yield its language, much of what we know from it is structure and context. Formulaic sequences recur on libation tables, probably naming deities, places or donors in a fixed order. Certain endings cluster after names and might be case markers. Some sequences sit next to ideograms for offerings, and may be verbs for to give or to dedicate. On administrative tablets, names of people and places recur alongside quantities. Month names, or at least seasonal markers, may be hiding in repeated entries. Out of this grows a cautious kind of understanding. We can watch a ritual economy move, even if we cannot pronounce the prayers that accompanied it. The sealing system stretches that understanding outward. Imagine a pythos in a cool magazine, its mouth sealed with a clay stopper. A string binds the lid. Over the string, a blob of clay receives the impression of a carved stone seal. A leaper and a bull, a lion, a rosette, a double axe. Break the seal and everyone can see it was opened. Tie a new string, apply a new seal, make a note on a tablet or a roundel. If the jar is transferred, a hanging nodule travels with it. If it sits, the seal sits too, a small badge of responsibility. The iconography matters because it is personal. Seals are wearable, owned, passed down. That is why so many impressions repeat at a site. That is why a single individual's presence can be tracked across rooms and days. Writing and image here are two halves of the same instrument. One tells how much and when, the other tells who. The changeover to Linear B at Knossos is not a simple conquest story. It reads as a managerial takeover. The new administrators write Greek with a Minoan-shaped tool. They keep counting oil, wool and grain. They still install scribes in the magazine wings, still send roundels with shipments, still like tidy columns of figures broken by dividers. Even when iconography shifts, more chariot parts, more weapons, a taste for symmetry, the underlying office habits feel familiar. In other words, when the language changes, the file system does not. That continuity speaks to the strength of Minoan bureaucratic practice. It was good enough to inherit. Some scraps hint that perishable writing once did the work that clay could not. A folded leather or papyrus document might be sealed shut with a nodule that carries both seal impression and a short label in Linear A. The label survives, the document does not. Wooden tablets or writing boards, waxed and inscribed with a stylus, could have held longer notes or messages. These would leave almost no trace unless fire charred them in place. That is one reason literature seems absent. The medium for story, hymn, or lore may simply have vanished. The clay we have is the shadow cast by a larger mixed media record-keeping system. Even when we cannot read the words, the scripts sketch a mental world. They assume standardized goods, standardized measures, standardized time, and chains of accountability. They assume officials who oversee districts, workshops that deliver quotas, sanctuaries that receive offerings on a calendar. They assume a society literate enough, at least among its clerks and overseers, to keep thousands of totals straight across seasons and storerooms. They also assume a ritual language braided into administration, the same hand that totals oil for perfuming notes, oil set aside for a goddess, the same month that schedules shearing schedules processions. The palace breathes in stock and breathes out ceremony. There are also the edge cases, the riddles that keep the subject alive. A bronze double axe from a cave bears incised signs that look like writing. Are they names, a dedication, a catalogue mark, or meaningless scratches imitating prestige? A stamped clay disc spirals with symbols unlike any other document. Was it a one-off experiment, or a genre we have seen only once? A handful of stone basins and offering tables carry patterns of Linear A words repeated from site to site. Perhaps a shared liturgy that wandered with travellers, merchants, and priests. Each fragment adds to the sense of a literate habit that was at once practical and sacred. Stand at the threshold of a magazine and picture the end of a busy day. The last jars are rolled into place. A guard presses his seal into a fresh nodule. A scribe tilts the tablet to check that the strokes are legible. The clay is set on a shelf to dry and do its job for a season. No one in that room thinks they're writing for you. They are writing for dawn, for next week's audit, for the festival at month's end. They trust the city around them, the nets of roads, the light wells, the drains, the courts, to carry people and goods where they ought to go. Their letters are short and their totals precise. The sea outside is the road. The script inside is the ledger that keeps the road open. And though we cannot yet read the sentences they wrote in their own language, we can read the shape of their minds in the steady, unshowy strokes of their hands. Picture the island as a harbour in the middle of moving water. From almost any ridge on Crete you can see the sea, and from almost any cove a crew can push off at dawn and be halfway to another island by afternoon. Ships thread everything together. They are long and lean in painted scenes, with high curling prows and sterns like raised eyebrows, a single steering oar to starboard, and rows of oarsmen whose strokes turn coastline into calendar. A mast can be stepped when the wind is right. An awning can shade the officers. Pennants flick in the breeze. On good days the sea is rowed. On bad days it is judge. The people who built court-centred towns learned the water's moods as closely as they learned stone and light. Routes follow season and wind. In summer, regular north winds, those hard, dry breaths that sweep down the Aegean, push sails southward and favour east-west passages. In spring and autumn, gentle southerlies tempt sailors home. Winter adds caution to every decision. A captain leaving a north coast harbour like Amnisos can angle toward the Cyclades, stop at Naxos or Paros for fresh water and news, then tack to Euboea or the mainland, or turn southeast toward Carpathos and Rhodes, where Anatolian shores whisper of copper and crafted goods. From Crete's south coast, ports like Komos below Paistos, the bow can face Africa and find Egypt's delta after days of horizon, or swing east to Cyprus. Each leg of the voyage is a string in a net that tightens around the island's courts. Cargo is not random. Outbound, there are amphorae for wine and oil, pithoi and jars for fish sauce and honey, fine tableware whose shape and paint advertise a palace's taste, textiles, wool most of all, folded and tallied by the bolt, perfumed oils scented with saffron or herbs, carved stone vases that flash when lifted, small bronzes and worked bone. Inbound there is copper in oxhide-shaped ingots, tin in lesser but precious quantities, gold hammered thin, silver in lumps, faience and coloured glass from Egyptian kilns, semi-precious stones, carnelian, agate, ready for drills and patient hands. Even timber travels when local stands cannot satisfy the shipwright's needs, mast straight trunks from mountains across the water. Some goods pass through rather than stop. Crete is a broker as much as a buyer. A harbour is an organism. Quays don't shout their presence after 3,500 years, but shorelines with straightened edges, revetments of heavy stone, and roads that meet water at proper angles tell their story. Warehouses sit within a short pull of the beach. Ramps help crews haul vessels onto the sand for cleaning and repair. A longhouse of planks and stone blocks keeps tools dry. Nearby you find the things of daily sea life. Patches for hulls, spare oars, coils of fibre rope, jars of pitch, wooden pegs in baskets for the hull's joints, bone toggles, and clay lamps scored black from nights when departure beat dawn. In the town behind, potters and smiths work within earshot of gulls, and a scribe has a small table by a doorway to record what goes in and out. Shipbuilding blends local habit with ideas from elsewhere. Planks are cut thin and joined edge to edge. Lashings and pegs hold seams. Seams are caulked. Ribs may be added after the shell, strengthening a hull that is already seaworthy. An eye is sometimes painted near the bow, a watch kept for good luck as much as for landfall. The craft is practical but not crude. A long boat that flexes with the swell, a steering oar that bites cleanly, a mast step that doesn't split under strain, a hull light enough to beach quickly and tough enough to ride a chop. These are decisions made by hands taught in harbours, changed in small ways when a new idea arrives tied to a different sail. Trade is counting as much as carrying. Jars are not just containers, they are units. A certain shape, a certain size, a certain impressed mark says, this much oil, that much wine. Weights of carefully graded stone rest near scales. A set of numerals scratched on a potsherd turns a market argument into a moment of agreement. Seal impressions on clay nodules close a jar's mouth or a storeroom door and declare responsibility. Open me, and your seal will say so. Roundels, the little clay receipts that travel with goods, allow a shipment to leave a port and arrive with its identity intact. Across the sea, a similar grammar is understood, because Crete's partners keep their own ledgers, and the handshake between systems is part of the exchange. Beyond objects, people move. A weaver's son apprentices with an uncle who lives in a harbour town. A perfumer's daughter marries into a family that oversees a shrine near a peak. A ship's pilot from a Cycladic island spends winter months mending nets and telling stories in a Cretan workshop. Foreigners settle for seasons or for good. Craftsmen who know a trick with metal inlay. Sailors who bring a song that fits a Cretan rhythm. Envoys who carry gifts and formal words. Aegean-style art appears in unlikely places across the water, and foreign motifs, lotus, papyrus, griffins, quietly take root in Cretan walls and rings. Exchange is not only goods but frames of mind. The sea itself is a teacher. Dolphins that play in the bow wave become painters' companions on plaster. Octopuses that clutch a pot or a rock become potters' tutors when they curl across a jar. The rhythm of oars writes itself into procession scenes on walls. Risk is remembered in the way a crew times the crossing between islands, in how a captain hugs a lee shore when clouds build in the northwest, in the caution that keeps winter voyages short. Prosperity is remembered in the steady hum of stored oil, the glitter of imported stone in a seal, the smell of new wood shavings in a boat shed. Some places on Crete specialise because geography invites it. The east, close to the Dodecanese and routes towards Cyprus, feels like an open doorway. The south, facing Africa, sends signals down to the Nile and the Levant. The north, within day sail reach of many Cycladic harbours, becomes the island's busiest edge. Inland palaces are never truly inland. A day's walk to a port is simply another link in the chain. Roads from courts to coves and back again carry goods, news, people and animals, and those roads show the same care in paving and drainage that palace corridors show. Another reminder that on Crete, movement is a craft. What travels with cargo but is lighter than wool and more valuable than gold? Knowledge. A recipe for perfumed oil, how long to steep saffron when to add myrtle, can cross water in a mouth and settle in a new workshop. A new ratio for weights so that different systems can talk to each other can be drawn in the air with a hand and learned by an apprentice. A way to stitch a sail more tightly, a better angle for a steering oar's blade, a trick for firing a kiln evenly. These are the invisible freights of a maritime society. When people speak of a sea-based power, they often imagine fleets and tribute. On Crete, power looks more like confidence with connections, a faith that the island's harbours will always fill and empty with the right things at the right times. As the island's network matures, its art and accounting show the same maturity. Marine-style pottery blooms not by accident, but because people living among ropes and waves keep seeing the same animals and lines. Sealstones show ships with crews moving under awnings. Wall paintings show flotillas between islands, flags fluttering, dolphins keeping pace. The bureaucracy's tablets, where preserved by fire, record wool tallies, oil deliveries, metal allotments, nothing romantic, everything essential. The sea is thrilling. The ledger keeps it honest. Now turn from harbours and ships to the high places and the deep places, for ritual on Crete does not hide in rooms alone. It climbs mountains and descends into caves. A peak sanctuary is a low-walled scatter of stones, a small altar, a place where wind carries voices and the island spreads at your feet. From the court at Knossos you can see Mount Juktas, and from Juktas, on a clear day, you can see the sea in 3 directions. Offerings pile up over years. Little terracotta human figures with arms lifted, miniature animals, clay models of limbs and organs left in hope or thanks. Ash from burned sacrifices settles into thin, dark layers between stones. People who spend their days among walls and drains come up here to feel sky, to put the island, the ships, the fields into one view and bind them with words and smoke. Caves answer the peaks, cool all summer, dripping in winter. They are stone throats that hold the island's breath. In places like the Psychro Cave on the Dikte Plateau, offerings accumulate in pools and on ledges, simple cups, bronze double axes, pins and rings, sometimes objects for which no practical reason can be given beyond devotion. A cave's darkness makes a different kind of theatre than a court. Voices are small, lamps flare, and every step is a decision. A descent can stand for healing or petition, for renewal or return. A climb back to daylight can be a ritual of relief. The same people who turned sunlit basins into sacred spaces build their courage by water sounds in stone. Symbols are simple enough to carve yet deep enough to linger. 2 rise again and again. The double axe, the lebrise, appears incised on pillars, cut in relief on offering tables, carried in small as a votive and in large as a display piece. Its edges can be sharp in the workshop and symbolic in the sanctuary. It marks places and moments as set apart. The other is a pair of upturned curves often called horns of consecration. They echo bull's horns but also frame the sky, set along roofs and parapets perched on the edge of courts, placed on miniature shrines. They make thresholds visible. Pass between them, and you have crossed into a charged zone even if no wall says so. Ritual is not a single act but a braid. Processions move through the architecture, and the architecture answers with routes and platforms. People carry ritter, conical or animal-headed vessels, filled with liquid that pours in smooth arcs into bowls and basins. Kernoi, stone rings with cup-like cavities, hold grains, fruits, oils, flowers, a garden laid out in stone. Music follows, double pipes, rattles, small harps, hand claps, The harvester procession carved on a stone vessel shows a singer with his mouth open and his chest full. You can hear him even in silence. The body knows the steps, the hand knows the weight of the vessel, the eye follows painted lines on walls that echo the living line of the procession below them. Animals take part, sometimes as symbol, sometimes as sacrifice. Bulls dominate the imaginative field, strength, danger, cycle. But rams, goats and deer appear too. Bones bearing cut marks in sanctuary deposits suggest that feasting often followed offerings. The sacred and the social share a table. Evidence for blood-heavy rites is rare and debated. Occasional readings of particular ruins hint at extremes, but the enduring picture is of orderly offerings, measured libations, shared meals, and repeatable performances that mark the year. A calendar is present even when its words escape us. Planting and harvest, shearing and wine pressing, the first oil of the season, the first fruits of orchards, the quieting of fields in heat, the stirring of movement when rains return. Inside the palaces, certain rooms carry a charge beyond their plaster and paint. A sunken lustral basin down a few steps, coated smooth, sits in suites where formal halls open and close with pier and door partitions. Whether bodies bathed there in water or people descended symbolically, the space is set apart by its very architecture. Pillar crypts, low rooms with 1 or 2 square pillars, often incised with double axes, gather cool air and quiet. Benches run along walls in council-like arrangements. A gypsum seat flanked by painted griffins presides over a chamber where low light and hard stone make posture, silence and sound part of the rite. These interiors rhyme with peaks and caves, descent and ascent, light and shade, open sky and contained breath. If divinities were pictured, they often arrive as presence rather than portrait. Signet rings in gold show scenes where a female figure stands on a hilltop between horns, or appears before a tree tied with ribbons, or rides the air above a shrine as if the moment were an epiphany, a sudden showing to celebrants below. Sometimes a male figure appears, often smaller in scale, sometimes a hybrid attendant, the so-called Minoan genius, pot-bellied and soft-snouted, pours from a vessel over an altar. The effect is not of thrones and thunderbolts, but of place and appearance, a god or goddess who is the hill, the tree, the room when the room is ready. Women stand prominently in the scenes that survive, leading processions, seated to receive offerings, dancing. And that visibility matters even if we are careful with names and structures. It tells us that ritual costume, flounced skirts, fitted bodices, sashes, headdresses, was a public language, that jewellery wasn't just wealth, but belonging, that hair and fabric and movement were woven into acts of worship. Men, too, claim space, athletes, bearers, musicians, officiants, but the overall ensemble suggests a spectrum of roles rather than a single rigid hierarchy. A crowd can be sacred when every member knows the next step. Objects carry prayers in their surfaces. Stone libation tables bear short linear A inscriptions, repeated sequences that likely name deities, places, or donors, so that pouring liquid over carved words becomes speech in action. Small bronze double axes are left by the dozens in caves. Clay figurines with upraised arms pivot from individual plea to communal presence when 100 of them stand together on a sanctuary floor. A string of ceilings with impressions of horns, trees and altars may have tied a bundle of offerings and marked them as set apart. Ritual is portable. You can bring it in your hand, leave it in a crack in the rock, hang it on a peg in a pillar room, or carry it through a gate and across a court. Landscape is the temple's largest wall. From a peak you can see a chain of other peaks, each with its own small sanctuary. Below, farmsteads and fields grid the ground. Beyond, the sea repeats the sky. Routes between peaks, caves and palaces are not mere paths. They are processional lines that can be walked and remembered. A shrine on a knoll near a town's gate catches sunlight at a particular hour. A court aligns so that dawn in a certain season pours exactly along its long axis. A doorway frames a mountain cutout that everyone knows by heart. The island itself participates. A lit mountain, a shadow that arrives on cue, a breeze that rises every afternoon, a spring that never fails. To move through this world is to move through a set of cues that teach the body when to speak and when to listen. At the smallest scale, ritual is a hand on a vessel and a quiet breath. At the largest, it is a people keeping faith with places that outlast them. The same society that planned, drained with patience, and measured out oil with tablets and weights also learned how to turn a court into a theatre and a hill into an altar. Ships leave, ships arrive, jars fill, jars empty, seasons turn. On certain days steps are swept, paints are freshened, horns are set straight along parapets, musicians warm their fingers, and the first notes float up into light. On other days, a single visitor leaves a small clay figure on a mountain top in weather that tests resolve. Both acts belong to the same story, the same island, the same understanding that trade and worship are not two worlds but one island life seen from sea level and from the sky. Walk a narrow street in a Minoan town and you'll brush stone walls smoothed by elbows and baskets. Houses rise 2 or even 3 stories where the ground permits, each level slightly offset to catch light and air. A doorway opens from the lane into a dim, cool anteroom used for storage and work. From there a few steps climb to the main living floor, the bright story, where windows face a small court or light well. Floors are beaten earth or laid with plaster. Thresholds are stone, walls wear a lime wash that keeps heat at bay. The plan is tight but thoughtful. A hearth for cooking stands near a vent. A niche holds a household shrine, perhaps a small table with horns or a snake tube. Bench seats are built into the masonry so furniture need not be moved for work. Staircases of stone or wood hug walls and turn corners like a spiral of muscle, leading up to a roof terrace where jars dry, herbs hang, and family members sleep on hot nights beneath a sky clear enough to cut on. Water shapes the routine. A cistern or large jar at the base of a downspout catches rain from the flat roof. Terracotta pipes slip under floors to carry waste to a laneside drain. In better appointed homes, a small plastered room with a clay bathtub appears, a luxury made practical by gravity-fed water and clever channels. The smell of the lane, olive smoke, wet plaster, a tang of fish from a neighbour's basket, tells time as well as any shadow. Lanes are not mere gaps between buildings, they are workshops, play spaces and meeting points, edged by doorstones, polished by sandals. Children thread the gaps with reed toys or small clay animals. A dog sleeps where warmth radiates from a wall. A potter hauls a tray of cups toward the kiln. Cooking is heat managed with care. Tripod cooking pots and deep, round-bodied jars squat over charcoal. Lids are weighted with small stones. A cook's hand knows how to bank the fire so pulses simmer while bread bakes. Grains, barley foremost, with emmer and einkorn wheat, arrive at the house as rough measure in baskets, are poured into storage jars, threshed at the village floor, winnowed on breezy afternoons, and ground between saddle quern and handstone. Grit from the quern finds its way into bread. Many skeletons show teeth worn like river stones, enamel polished by a lifetime of tiny minerals. Bread is often flat and quick, baked on hot stones or in a clay dome that traps heat. When leavened loaves appear, they rise as slowly as seasons. Oil and wine anchor the pantry and the economy. Olive harvest begins when the fruit turns dull purple. Families beat branches with poles, gather olives on cloths, and carry them to installations where pulp is crushed in basins and pressure expressed either by levered beams or stacked weights. The first flow is green gold and peppered with bitterness. Later pressings grow cloudier, destined for lamps and soap. Grapes dry on mats for raisins or are crushed by foot in plastered treading floors. must runs into jars to ferment in cool corners. Wine travels well inside amphorae sealed with clay and resin. It returns as gifts from friends a sea away. Honey sweetens what wine and oil cannot. Hives kept in stacked clay cylinders yield comb for chewing and wax for lamps and seals. The drone of bees near a courtyard fig tree is the island's soft metronome. Diet is Mediterranean and ingenious. Chickpeas, lentils, and broad beans simmer into stews. Onions, leeks, and garlic thicken broths. Wild greens collected from hillsides. Chicory, mallow, fennel fronds brighten winter bowls. Figs split under the sun and are laid out to dry. Pomegranates are a seasonal prize. Apples and pears keep well in cool rooms. Herbs, thyme, oregano, savoury, turn fish and goat into feasts. Meat is not daily fare for most, but regular enough across the year. Goat and sheep provide milk, cheese, and occasional slaughter. Pigs contribute fat and flavour. Cattle are valuable for traction and sacrifice. Their bones are rarer find in kitchen pits. Deer and wild goat, cree-cree, enter the pot when hunting is good. Fish, tuna when shoals run. Mackerel and sardines more often. Cephalopods when luck and skill align. Arrive with nets weighted by clay sinkers. Shellfish are plucked from rocks at low tide. Salt, collected from pans or traded, makes preservation a craft. Fish are brined, olives cured, cheeses dried to hard nubs that grate into soups. Textiles turn homes into humming workshops. The warp-weighted loom leans like a doorway against a wall, its warp threads hanging like a waterfall held by rows of baked clay loom weights. A spinner's fingers draw out wool from a carded bundle, twist it with a drop spindle in a rhythm that never stops, even while walking and talking. Women and girls, sometimes men in specialised shops, manage the sequence from fleece to fabric, washing, picking, carding, spinning, dyeing, weaving. Dye is derived from plants and shells, saffron for yellow, madder for reds, weld and broom for bright tones, and along some coasts, the laborious purple of murex snails reserved for small stripes or prestige bands. Finished cloth is measured not only for household use but for delivery. Rations and quotas move as textiles in a world where a bolt can pay a worker and dress a procession. Needles of bone or bronze stitch seams, pins and fibulae fasten garments, belts cinch waists to the Minoan silhouette seen in frescoes. Pottery is the island's voice in fired clay. In town blocks, kilns squat in backplots ringed by dumps of misfired sherds, learning curves fossilised in broken rims. The potter's wheel, introduced in the early 2nd millennium BCE, spins in workshops where an apprentice pumps the flywheel with his foot, while the master pulls clay into thin-walled cups or belly jars as light as breath. The feet we call kamaras wear. Coarse cooking ware is tempered with grit so it won't crack. Fine tableware takes slips and burnishes that let paint glide. Forms have jobs, stirrup jars with false necks and a real spout for oil, pithoi for bulk storage, transport amphorae with strong shoulders and balanced weight, juglets for perfume. Each form reads like a verb in a sentence of daily life. Metalwork smells of charcoal and flux. In small foundries, crucibles scorch to a deep red near their lip. Tuyères, clay nozzles, hiss as bellows feed air into a brazier, and molten copper alloyed with tin flows like sunlight into stone moulds. Early on, arsenic hardens copper. Tin bronze becomes the standard when trade regularizes supply. Axes, chisels, knives, and sickles are cast, hammered, sharpened, and sometimes riveted to tangs. Swords and spearheads are rarer in Minoan contexts than in mainland ones, but present enough to remind you that tools and weapons share family trees. Lost wax casting produces small figurines, rings, and fittings with a delicacy that rivals carving. Inlay brings gold into bronze the way dawn enters a room. Scraps are never truly scrap. Every shaving finds its way back into the pot. Work is organised by neighbourhood and season. A street might hum with loom beats in spring, then turn to oil jars and presses in autumn. Some houses combine trade and dwelling, with a shop front room opening to the lane, pottery to the left, scales and weights to the right, a bench for customers who also happen to be neighbours. Rations, as grain, oil, cloth, pass from palace magazines to workshops, and finished goods return to the magazines in balanced streams. People who work under palace oversight also work for themselves in the interstices. Contracts live in habits and seals as much as on clay. Labour is family, kin and crew, but also teams drawn from multiple households and villages when harvest peak or construction demands muscle. Time is told by light and by calendars kept in heads and sanctuaries. Dawn on a north-facing window means morning chores. The first chorus of cicadas announces peak heat. Shadows that shrink across the court tell when a procession should begin. A month might be named for a festival or a crop. The year turns on harvests and shearing. Music drifts from courtyards when a girl comes of age, or a partnership is sealed. A small travelling piper earns dinner by turning a lane into a dance. Crafts share space with play. Knucklebones clatter. A model boat floats in a cistern. A boy's reed flute learns a grown man's tune. Health is managed with herbs and experience. Fennel to settle the stomach. Thyme steam for a cold. Olive oil for wounds. Poppy sap to quiet pain in careful drops. Midwives know their work. Bones mend in splints made from olive twigs and linen. Life is not long by modern measure, but it's filled with skill, repeated acts sharpened into quiet mastery. Then, without warning but not without precedent, the ground reminds everyone where they live. The Aegean is a ring of restless stone. Earthquakes shake palaces and towns often enough that timber weaves through walls as a matter of course. Destruction layers, burnt floors, collapsed staircases, pithoi crushed like eggs, mark several moments of crisis and rebuilding. Around the early 1700s BCE, many centres suffer. They rise again with greater ambition, new plaster over old scars. Houses remember quakes in their thickened jambs and pin thresholds. People rebuild not because they forget, but because building is how they live here. One catastrophe, though, exceeds memory. On the island of Thera, Santorini, north of Crete, a volcano swells and breaks in a sequence that ends with a caldera-forming eruption in the mid-2nd millennium BCE. Its exact date is still a scholar's argument. Radiocarbon and ice core evidence point around 1620 to 1600 BCE. Some archaeological synchronisms have nudged later, but the event's scale is not in doubt. Ash falls in heavy blankets across nearby Cycladic islands. On Thera itself, the town of Akrotiri is entombed so completely that rooms, staircases and frescoes survive like a breath held for 3.5 millennia. The sea heaves. Tsunami deposits at a few Cretan sites hint at surges that ran up low coasts. Harbours would have been battered, fleets scattered or lost. Ash on Crete is generally light and patchy, far from the volcano's throat, but even light ash can trouble crops, and weeks of dimmed skies can stall voyages and unsettle animals. Yet the island does not fall silent. Knossos and other centres continue. Workshops hum. Marine-style pottery, octopuses stretched across jars, blooms after the eruption, suggesting that the sea still feels like a friend. Resilience is not bravado. It is repair turned into rhythm. A town clears lanes, rebuilds roofs, replasters walls. Alternatively, some coastal communities falter and shift inland. The archaeological record catches movement in the way one neighbourhood empties while a new one rises upslope. The palaces just. Rituals recalibrated, storerooms refilled, road networks checked and mended where quakes have opened seams in the land. Another wave of destructions arrives around 1450 BCE. This time many palatial centres across Crete burn or are abandoned in a relatively short span. Knossos, unusually, remains active and even expands its administrative reach. but the language in its offices changes. Linear B, the script of early Greek, appears in the records. The ledgers look familiar, the hands are new. Workshop terms continue. Oil still smells like pepper and grass when fresh. Wool still squeaks faintly when stretched on the loom, but chariot parts, armour items, and more rigid symmetrical motifs in art hint at tastes and priorities that lean closer to the mainland's Mycenaean courts. Palace-style pottery tightens the loose spirals of earlier decades into panels and bands. Fresco programs take on more heraldic arrangements. Griffins flanking seats, processions more formal, less buoyant. Why the fires? Explanations braid together rather than compete. Earthquakes always lurk, capable of starting blazes in towns of a lamp oil and timber. Political conflict between Cretan centres, between Cretan and mainland powers, could turn a quake's damage into an opportunity for takeover. Trade routes frayed by earlier disasters may have left some regions weaker, their stores lower, their alliances brittle. Internal social tensions, the strain between centralised demand and local autonomy, are harder to see but no less real. The ceilings and tablets record compliance, not the negotiations required to achieve it. When the dust settles, administration is more centralised at Knossos than before, but its vocabulary is hybrid. Cretan architecture and filing habits hosting Greek words and Mycenaean titles. Even that synthesis does not last forever. Sometime in the later 14th century BCE, Knossos' palatial administration ends in destruction. By the 13th century, Crete is a patchwork of towns without a single island-wide centre. Across the eastern Mediterranean, the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE bring cascading disruptions, the so-called Bronze Age collapse. In the Aegean, major mainland palaces burn. In Anatolia, archives fall silent. In Egyptian inscriptions, pharaohs boast of turning back sea peoples, while also recording famine and migration. For Crete, the picture is uneven. Some sites shrink, others shift location. Burial customs change with painted larnacs, coffins, and new tomb forms appearing. Mycenaean-style pottery dominates, then gives way to regional hands that will lead toward the early Iron Age. Trade does not vanish, but its web slackens. Long-distance luxuries become rarer. Local clay and stone speak more loudly again. Climate likely presses from beneath the visible crises. Periods of drought or erratic rainfall can make an olive harvest fail and send flocks to poor pasture, which in a redistributive economy cascades into shortfalls for rations, festivals and diplomacy. A single bad year is a wound, several in a row are a fracture. Earthquakes continue to write marginal notes in stone. Political fractures open along old lines. A valley that once supplied a palace tries to go its own way. A harbour town turns its face to a different partner over the horizon. The skills that made resilience possible earlier, repair, redistribution, ritual cohesion, meet the limits of scale when too many edges of the system fray at once. Through these changes, ordinary life adapts in practical human ways. A family moves to a house one room smaller, but keeps its loom. A smith melts down a broken chisel to make 2 knives. Fields are replanted with hardier pulses when barley disappoints. A festival shortens but does not disappear. A shrine shifts from palace courtyard to hilltop and persists with fewer hands and quieter songs. Children still trace spirals in dust with reeds. Elders still tell of a time when dolphins on plaster seemed to swim. The island remains what it has always been. Mountains, basins, coves, winds that arrive in the afternoon, night skies that pour down in summer like water. Disaster writes in bold, change writes in italics. Daily living fills the page between with the small, precise script of work and care. Begin with a story everyone knows, then look for the stone beneath it. A bull king on an island, a maze no one could master, a girl with a thread, a young hero who trusts her and finds his way back out. The myth of Theseus and the Minotaur is a braid made of alder cords that runs straight through Crete. Bulls thunder on Minoan walls, horns crown parapets, reta shaped like bulls' heads pour libations in palace courts. Take that language of animals and power, put it into the mouths of mainland storytellers who visited, traded or conquered, and it becomes a monster housed in corridors that bewilder. The labyrinth itself may whisper the word Labrise, the double axe incised on pillars and carved on altars, so that Labyrinthos is quite literally the place of the double axe, a palace turned into a puzzle in memory. When an Athenian prince survives by following a clue of yarn, a practical trick becomes a metaphor so strong that our modern word clue keeps the old thread inside it, a reminder that guidance often arrives as something you can hold. Ariadne stands at the centre of that tale with a gesture that feels older than any single version. She sees, she understands, and she gives the tool that makes escape possible. On Naxos, another story says, she finds not abandonment but a god. Dionysus claims her, crowns her, and sets her among the stars where a diadem becomes a constellation. Strip away later embellishments, and what remains is a figure who mediates between danger and dance, dark and light, labyrinth and sky. In some Greek accounts, Theseus returns to Delos and teaches the islanders a winding chain dance, the Geronos, the crane, whose steps twist and untwist like corridors learned and then mastered. On Homer's shield of Achilles glitters a dancing floor that Daedalus made for Ariadne of the lovely hair in broad Knossos. Even in epic memory, the island is a place where craft becomes choreography. Daedalus himself is a myth with a draftsman's hands. He is the patron saint of clever joints and well-ventilated rooms, of stairs that climb around light wells, of doors that open and close in elegant sequences, of inventions that solve problems you didn't know you had. When later Greeks looked at Minoan architecture, polythyra that reconfigure space, drains that keep rooms sweet, timber-laced masonry that rides out earthquakes, they recognized an intelligence different from their own Megaron logic and gave it a name: Daedalus. His son Icarus falls because flight is a technical triumph that forgets risk, an engineer's cautionary tale, and the water where he fell remembers him in its name, the Icarian Sea. The story of father and son is the kind of lesson that a maritime people would tell their apprentices. Materials have limits, heat is not abstract, height dazzles and kills. Crete holds both halves comfortably, the audacity that makes the wings, and the wisdom that says wax softens in sun. Another bull crosses the water from the east and never leaves. Europa, princess of Tyre, climbs onto a white bull whose calm eyes promise safety. The bull surges into the sea, carries her to Crete, and there reveals himself as Zeus. She becomes the island's queen, and bears sons, Minos, Rhadamanthes, Sarpedon, whose authority echoes down to the underworld where judges must be as steady as stone. A Phoenician girl becomes the mother of a European world. Her name stretches across a continent. In that one story, a seaborne connection turns into kinship, trade becomes family, and a mingled heritage is claimed as destiny. The island keeps the memory in place, names and caves, Zeus hidden from his father's hunger in Cretan rock, Rhea nursing him in the dark, goat bells and dripping stalactites chiming a lullaby that turned a child into a thunderer. Walk the rims of Crete, and you can almost see Talos, the bronze giant who strides around the shore 3 times a day, patrolling with metal feet that spark on the stones. He hurls rocks at raiders. He glows with heat. A single vein sealed with a pin keeps his life fluid in place. He is a machine in myth, a living automaton powered by a simple rule: protect the island. For a culture that cast bronze with skill and loved devices that work quietly and forever if you tend them. Drains, hinges, pivots, pipes. Talos is a fantasy of security made from the materials at hand. Peel back the bronze and you find customs patrols, watchtowers, fast boats, and the confidence of harbours well kept. Leave the bronze on, and you have a guardian whose footsteps sound like the surf. Greek historians look backward toward Crete and see the outline of empire floating in the haze. Thucydides, listing the early thalassocracies, gives Minos pride of place as the first to hold a navy, clear pirates from sea lanes, and settle islands with colonists. Homer calls Crete 100-citied and gives Minos a 9-year cycle of council with Zeus. Those phrases, navy, council, cities without number, are ways for later Greeks to make sense of an earlier island whose power did not look like their own. They give the Minoan sea network a word they understand, rule, and they give the island's ritual calendar a number that measures importance. You can hear admiration in the lines. You can also hear the distance between things remembered and things known. From Crete, certain gestures flow into Greek religion and stay there, even after languages change. The epiphany of a god or goddess on a hilltop or at a sacred tree, the use of horns to mark holy space, libations poured in sequences that repeat a known order, processions that move through towns and up to peaks where the world opens, the sense that dance is not ornament but offering. The island's way of making place and ritual talk to each other becomes one thread in a wider tapestry that Greeks weave for centuries. Mountain sanctuaries that see the sea, caves with tables for gifts, altars where liquid speaks. The names shift. Ariadne becomes a bride of Dionysus. Local goddesses learn to answer to Hera, Artemis or Rhea. Daedalus is adopted as an Attic craftsman, but the choreography remains legible. Some influences are visual and immediate. The Mycenaean palaces that rise on the mainland after Crete's zenith adopt fresco programs whose winding plants, leaping animals, and lively borders show a hand trained in Cretan habits. The marine style swims ashore and becomes a mainland taste, even where subject matter changes. More chariots, more weapons. The curling line survives. Pottery forms standardize across the Aegean, and a stirrup jar thrown on one island pours oil in a city far away, with the confidence that everyone knows how to hold it. Administrative logic, seals, nodules, roundels, tablets, becomes a shared grammar that lets a late archive at Pylos speak to one at Knossos without a translator in the room, because the work itself is translation. Myth does not only look backward, it also refracts the present of those who tell it. When Athenians say their young men and women once sailed as tribute to a bull king until Theseus ended the horror, they are telling a story about vulnerability turned into virtue, dependence into independence, fear into cunning and courage. Whether any shipments of tribute ever left Attica is beside the point. The myth trains a city to see itself as the kind that can enter a maze of power and come out with both honour and life. The island becomes foil, stage and teacher all at once, a place where Athens learned to be Athens by learning to be clever in Cretan corridors. The modern world finds its own reflections on those painted walls and stepped courts. When Arthur Evans cleared and sometimes boldly restored Knossos, he minted images that sped across postcards, schoolbooks, and the imaginations of artists who were looking for a pre-classical Greece that moved and breathed. Picasso seized the Minotaur and made him an avatar of appetite, terror, and tenderness. The surrealist turned the labyrinth into a map of the mind. Jorge Luis Borges wrote a short story from the Minotaur's point of view, The House of Asterion, and gave the monster thoughts as lonely as long corridors. Mary Renaud sent Theseus back to Crete in a novel, and made bull-leaping an initiation that asks a boy to become a dancer in the mouth of danger. Architects starved for air and light looked at Minoan courts and light wells, and felt permission to cut buildings open again and let them breathe. Museum designers study the way a corridor can reveal a scene slowly, and learn to stop trying to show everything at once. On Crete itself, the legacy is both quiet and daily. Motifs that once signalled sanctity now decorate ceramics in market stalls. A pair of stylized horns sits on a cafe shelf because it looks right there. A labyrinth printed on a label reassures a buyer that the maker is local, thread as trademark. School children go to Heraklion Archaeological Museum and come home drawing octopuses across their notebooks, tentacles curling around geometry exercises. In summer, music floods courtyards the way it must have during feasts 3,000 years ago. Circle dances tangle and untangle. Elders call steps that feel older than words. A visitor climbs Siluritis or Dicte and leaves a small stone on a cairn without being told why that is the thing to do. The island's ritual grammar still reads, "Archaeology keeps myth honest, and myth keeps archaeology human." The material record says, here are the drains, the pithoi, the tablets, the bull's horns, the benches, the basins, the rooms where 20 people could wait in shade for a door to open. Myth says, here is what it felt like to face a charging animal and trust your training. Here is what it meant to carry a cup of wine through a crowd and not spill a drop. Here is how a city imagined its debts and its deliverance. Here is why a girl's gift of thread can outlast a king's command. The two do not cancel each other, they illuminate. When excavators find a courtyard whose paving stones are worn smooth in two long paths, the line from Homer's dancing floor to those shine marks feels less like metaphor and more like the way memory and limestone talk. The island's legacy also lives in the problems it sets and the patience it teaches. Linear A remains unread. The Phaistos disk still spins its riddle. The exact date of the Thera eruption continues to draw scientists and philologists into the same room to argue kindly about tree rings, ice cores, and trade routes. Each enigma creates a community. Classicists who learn chemical signatures, chemists who learn case endings, divers who read shorelines the way epigraphers read tablets. Crete trains disciplines to borrow tools from each other because the past it offers is complex enough to deserve them. Stand once more in a palace court and look outward. Beyond the parapet with its horns, a mountain glows. Beyond the mountain, the faint line of sea. Beyond the sea, other coasts filled with their own stories. Inside, painted dolphins still seem to swim. A bull's head carved in stone still watches a doorway. A floor polished by feet still holds a dance that can be started again by anyone who knows the first step. The myths remember characters and crises. The stones remember habits and hands. Between them is the legacy, a way of making beauty serve use, and use serve beauty. A way of aligning buildings with wind and ritual with calendar. A way of turning danger into art and art into instruction. A way of teaching later ages, quietly without sermons, that the oldest European city we know loved light, honoured skill, trusted the sea, and built its identity out of movement, memory, and the intelligence of craft.